This time we find 5 more motorcycle fails. The motorcycle market is a complex one. It's very difficult to break into, so failure is always an option. Here are 5 motorcycle fails, which perhaps shouldn't have been. The Yamaha GTS 1000. Now Yamaha do like to do things a little bit differently. If you don't believe me, look at their strange 2-wheel contraption they've got in production at the moment. And the GTS is one such machine. It was produced between 1993 and 1999, although it was actually only sold in America for about a year. It featured an all-new frame concept called the Omega frame. It had front swinging arm suspension, single-sided, and single-sided suspension on the rear also. The chassis concept was simple. Under braking, the swinging arm suspension wouldn't dive as conventional forks do. Unique features to the machine included electronic fuel injection, a catalytic converter, and even ABS brakes. But in some ways, the machine was less modern. The engine was just a detuned version of the FZR 1000 motor, detuned to around 100 horsepower. This fairly modest level of power wouldn't help the machine's overall sales. As a concept, the machine worked. However, it wasn't sufficiently better than conventional forks to justify the excess cost. As a result, sales of the machine were fairly modest, at least by Yamaha standards. In fact, it is the most successful hub-centre steering machine in terms of sales. It took that particular honour away from the nearer car of the 1920s. But nevertheless, sales were not great, hence the fairly short period of production, particularly in the United States. And Yamaha never really achieved the sales targets that they'd aimed for. The Silk 700S. George Silk owned an engineering company who had the rather novel idea of putting essentially a Scott engine into a modern frame. He didn't have the rights to the Scott name, so in the end he used his own name, Silk, and designed his own modernised version of the Scott engine, and this would be the 700S. The frame was provided by Spondon and gave the machine excellent handling. The Scott-based 2-stroke engine, although it differed in many ways from the original Scott motor, had fairly similar character. It developed good low-down torque and made a wonderful yowl when it was running. Unfortunately, it only made around 48 horsepower, which by the mid-70s wasn't really sufficient to be regarded as a performance machine. But the major problem for the bike was the fact that it cost £1,355, which in 1975 was a small fortune. Not surprisingly, sales were fairly slow. This was, after all, a hand-built machine with essentially a 1920s, although admittedly considerably uprated, engine. The Scott has great character and has a wonderful chassis, but that wasn't enough really to make the machine a success. And Silk Engineering did not have the capacity to build the machine in sufficient numbers to make it economically viable. By 1978, the company had produced just 1/100th of these 110 mile-an-hour machines, but was in fact losing money on each one it produced. So George Silk took the hard decision of ending production, and so ended a fairly unusual escapade into 2-stroke motorcycling. The Motor Guzzi 250T, a Benelli 250 2C. Motor Guzzi have actually produced a number of 2-strokes over the years, though of course they're much more famous for their 4-stroke bikes. These had normally been around 50 to 75cc capacities. However, with the advent of the Ditomeso era and the fact that companies were merged effectively with Benelli, they began to use what was actually the Benelli 2-stroke parallel twin. This was a 250cc capacity, produced around 25 horsepower, and had a top speed of around 90 miles an hour, claimed at least. And these are fairly decent figures for the era. The chassis was excellent, as were the brakes. Unfortunately, the bike couldn't compete on price terms with the Japanese opposition. There were a lot of Japanese 2-strokes in that period. The build quality didn't meet that of the Japanese, and even worse, it didn't have an auto lube system, which by the 1970s was pretty much expected on a 2-stroke. Had the machine been around in the 1960s, this wouldn't have been a problem, but by the mid-70s, it was really not acceptable. As a result, Sales were fairly poor, and the bike was only in production for a couple of years before blinking out of use in 1976. The Italjet Indians. This line of machine is essentially the brainchild of Floyd Clymer. Floyd Clymer was an American who was a famous writer, motorcycle racer and general competitor, and all-round motorcycle enthusiast. He purchased the Indian name in the mid-60s and had used its badge on a number of small capacity motorcycles, but he really wanted to produce a large capacity Indian. At the end of the 60s, Clymer came across the Italian company Italjet. They were producing a motorcycle which used their own frame with a Bonneville 650 engine inserted. Of course, this didn't sell in huge numbers because it was fairly pricey, but it was an excellent machine and was much lighter than the original Bonneville. This gave Clymer the idea of using an Italian chassis with a British engine and badging the thing as an Indian. He contacted Velocet for use of their 500cc Venom engine. He also came to an agreement with Royal Enfield for use of their Interceptor 2 engine. Clymer managed to get around 100 pre-production bikes built and was testing them out. Unfortunately, in 1970 Clymer would die, and thus really would end the whole project, and the company would sell only rebadged Oriental small capacity machines during the 1970s before once again going into liquidation. The ABC 400. ABC was a general engineering company in Britain, established in 1912. During the war they produced a lot of essentially aviation engines, but they did work on other engineering projects too. After the war, the company's lead designer, Granville Bradshaw, would develop the 400cc motorcycle. This used a flat twin engine with chain drive, a 4-speed gearbox, highly unusual at the time, and was one of the first machines to use a duplex frame. The company entered into a production agreement with Sopwith Aviation, who produced around 2,200 of the machines. However, the machine wasn't perfect. The machine uses an excellent aviation carburetor. Unfortunately, the manifold from the carburetor is extremely long and was very prone to icing. Bradshaw would design a heating element which would stop the thing icing up over winter. A bigger problem still was the fact they didn't bother to put a kickstart on it, which was pretty much expected on a machine by that time. You simply had to bump start the thing to get the thing going in the morning. It was a little bit behind the times by then. But in pretty much all other aspects, this was an excellent machine. Sopwith Aviation built the machine under licence. However, by 1920, Sopwith had gone bankrupt. Some production would carry on just under the ABC banner for a short time, but in 1923, all production of motorcycles would stop by ABC themselves. A 500cc version of the bike would be built, however, in France, and this would last a little longer, running till around 1925 and 1926. Another licence-built bike was also produced in Germany. Again, this ran till about 1925. In terms of production numbers, the French probably built the most, around 3,000 machines, but very few of these have survived. The problem with the machine is, in all cases, it was pretty much assembled by aviation companies. Aviation companies can build things to a very high quality, but building something down to a price is something they struggle with. And unfortunately the ABC struggled in the marketplace because it was just too expensive. Well, I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe. And of course, thank you very much for watching.